Most of us grow up absorbing the same quiet rule. When people misunderstand you, you explain. When they question you, you clarify. When they judge you unfairly, you defend yourself. Silence is often framed as weakness or guilt rather than a valid choice. Over time, explaining yourself stops feeling optional and begins to feel like a responsibility you are expected to carry. Yet almost everyone eventually meets someone who doesn't follow this rule. They stay quiet when accused, don't rush to correct false assumptions, and still walk away calmly. From the outside, this behavior feels unsettling and even confusing. It raises a simple but uncomfortable question. Why wouldn't they explain? Many people interpret this silence as emotional distance or poor communication. It is often labeled as arrogance, coldness, or avoidance. But psychology suggests something quieter and more intentional beneath it. Not all silence comes from confusion. Sometimes, silence comes from discernment. Modern culture treats explanation as a moral duty. You are expected to justify your intentions, clarify your emotions, and make yourself understandable to others, especially when tension appears. In this environment, silence feels like a violation rather than a boundary. The pressure to explain becomes constant and almost invisible. When explanation turns automatic, it begins to cost more than it gives. Each explanation becomes a small negotiation with someone else's judgment, where you soften your truth and reshape your experience to be accepted. Over time, your inner world starts to feel less like it belongs to you. It becomes something that needs approval. Psychologically, this creates a quiet loss of inner ownership. Your feelings feel debatable instead of personal. Your boundaries flexible instead of firm. Decisions that once felt clear begin to feel open for discussion. What used to feel private slowly becomes provisional. People who stop explaining themselves rarely begin that way. Most of them were once over-explainers who justified endlessly and tried very hard to be understood. Gradually, they notice how exhausting this pattern is. Something inside them begins to resist. The shift usually happens quietly. They realize that explanation doesn't always bring understanding. Sometimes it invites argument, control, or manipulation. Some people don't want clarity at all, they want leverage. The promise of being understood slowly collapses. Instead of speaking more, they begin to speak less. Not dramatically, and not out of anger, but out of awareness. They recognize what constant explanation costs their energy and identity. They see how often peace requires self-erasure, and they choose to protect themselves. Psychology links this change to an internal sense of stability. Their worth no longer depends on being understood or approved by others. Silence becomes a way to regulate emotional energy and protect boundaries. It is containment, not withdrawal. This choice is not always comfortable. There is pain in being misunderstood and grief in realizing that some people will never truly listen. Not because you failed to explain, but because they never intended to hear you. That realization can feel quietly devastating. Many people return to explaining at this point, hoping clarity will finally be enough. They soften more and justify deeper, repeating the same cycle. But those who remain silent learn something important. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. When someone stops explaining themselves, relationships begin to change. Some people drift away, frustrated by the lack of access, while others become more attentive and listen instead of demanding. A few remain, not because they understand everything, but because they respect what isn't offered. The social landscape quietly reorganizes. This filtering is not accidental. When explanation stops, performance stops as well. Without performance, only genuine connection remains. Silence reveals which relationships were built on access rather than respect. There is a common belief that communication solves everything, but psychology shows a more complex reality. Some conflicts are extended by explanation rather than resolved by it. Some boundaries only hold when they are not debated. Constant justification teaches others to question your autonomy. People who don't explain themselves understand this intuitively. They know the difference between conversations that build understanding and those that drain identity. They stay for the first and quietly exit the second. From the outside, this restraint may look cold, but from the inside, it feels stabilizing. When you stop explaining yourself, your nervous system begins to relax. You stop shaping yourself to be acceptable and stop translating emotions you haven't fully felt yet. Your sense of self becomes quieter and steadier. Silence starts to feel trustworthy. Here is the paradox. People who don't explain themselves often understand themselves deeply. Their quiet is not confusion but clarity without performance. They are not hiding. They are choosing where their voice belongs. Explanation is powerful, but only when it is freely given. When it is demanded or costs your sense of self, silence can be the healthier response. Sometimes self-respect does not sound like words at all. Sometimes it sounds like silence.